In the last session, we moved outside of Jewish territory into the region of Syro-Phoenicia, around Tyre and Sidon, where Jesus encountered a woman who entreated him to cure her daughter. Then, after feeding a crowd of 4,000, Jesus gets into the boat for the last time and crosses back to Jewish territory. During this crossing, the disciples were concerned about the bread that they had in the boat, or more particularly the bread they didn't have. Upon arrival at the shore of Galilee, the text begins what is known as the central section of the Gospel of Mark. In this section, framed by the cures of two blind men, Jesus explains what his understanding of Messiahship is all about. We heard the great confession of Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, and saw how he really misunderstood what that meant. Jesus then explained the notion to the crowds and the disciples. The session ended with the narrative of the Transfiguration. In the current session, we shall continue that journey from blindness to light begun last session. The first narrative to be discussed in this session is the cure of a young man with an unclean spirit. Again, the misunderstanding of the disciples is highlighted in this text. Jesus gives a second prediction of his passion, again to be misunderstood by his disciples. Their interest is not in what Jesus is saying. Rather, they're interested in who will wield the power in the kingdom of Jesus the Messiah. The 9th chapter of Mark ends with a rather peculiar text on temptation and the antidotes to temptation. Our session will end with a discussion of the divorce text at the beginning of chapter 10 of Mark, along with a few comments on marriage. Following the Transfiguration, there is the discussion of the coming of Elijah, taking up the tradition that Elijah would precede the Messiah. Jesus informs the disciples that Elijah has already come, as we have seen in the person of John the Baptist, and, quote, they did to him whatever they pleased. Then comes the major passage of chapter 9, the cure of a boy with an unclean spirit. The text has four major parts. Jesus returns to the public arena from his time with the disciples. Secondly, the father of the possessed boy speaks to Jesus, entreating him. Third, Jesus exorcises the demons. And fourth, Jesus speaks privately with the disciples. From the description of the boy given in the text, many today have suggested that this is an epileptic seizure, and really not miraculous at all. What we call epilepsy today certainly was not known as that in Jesus' day. It was seen as not being in control of one's body. One seemed to be possessed by another. More than likely, it was epilepsy in our understanding. But the fact that it was cured at the word of Jesus constitutes its miraculous nature. As Jesus and three disciples return from the mountain experience to join the others, they see what has happened while they were away. A crowd has gathered around the disciples, and the scribes from that crowd are debating with them. The crowd seemingly is positive towards Jesus, as their reaction upon seeing him is amazement and running toward him. They greet him. So still, when Jesus tries to get some time alone, he is pursued by crowds. Jesus, as we have seen before, asks the disciples what the topic of discussion was with the scribes. The answer is headed off by a person in the crowd who has a request of Jesus. A man has brought his son who is possessed with a mute spirit. There are things that are more important than scribal debate. Here a person is at stake. The man had brought his son to the disciples to no avail. Now he entreats Jesus. A description of the son's condition is given by the man. The demon seizes him, causes him to fall. He foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. It is this description that leads contemporary interpreters to say that we're dealing with epilepsy here. Then the man tells Jesus that he has brought this to the disciples in Jesus' absence. But most translations say that they were unable. However, the Greek, oh, here it is again, carries another nuance. They did not have the strength in Greek means to, iskuo, the verb iskuo in Greek means to be strong. So now the man comes to beg the stronger one, as Jesus was presented in Mark 3:27, to do the exorcism. Jesus' answer is exasperation. O unbelieving generation. Now this can be seen to refer to the man and the crowd, but the fact that the man is coming to Jesus would preclude that. Rather, I believe it is directed at the disciples, who have been shown in this gospel to be unbelieving, or at least unwilling to do what belief requires. How long shall I be with you? He says in exasperation. How long shall I put up with you? Jesus continues. Again, these statements seem to lead to the conclusion that Jesus' exasperation is with the disciples. The disciples have failed now, and it's up to Jesus to resolve the situation. Bring him to me, Jesus says, and they do it. There is an immediate reaction to the demon, from the demon upon being brought into Jesus' presence. The evil spirit convulses the boy, causing him to fall to the ground, roll around, and foam at the mouth. Jesus sees for himself the situation of the young lad and asks the father, how long? How much time? Note, the word used here is the word for clock time in Greek, chronos. Has this been happening to him? The father replies, from childhood. Since we don't know the age of the child at this time, we can't really determine the length of time the boy has been possessed. The father continues, describing in vivid detail the situation of his son. The demon would throw him into the fire or water to destroy him. Note, the word for throw here, ekbalo, is the same as the word used of the Spirit bringing Jesus to the desert in the temptation narrative. Then the Father gets to his request. If you are able, help us, have mercy on us. There is that wonderful Greek verb again, splanknidzomai. Please find it in the depth of your being to put an end to all of this, the Father is imploring. Jesus' response emphasizes the necessity for all miraculous acts in this gospel, faith. He repeats the Father's words, if you are able, almost as a retort. Of course I am able. A primary principle of the gospel is given, one, by the way, the disciples do not seem to be getting. All things are possible for one who believes, that is, has faith. And conversely, little is possible for the one with no faith. The fact that the Father is before Jesus with his Son is a testament to his faith. And the Father attests to that, shouting out, I believe, help my unbelief. The Father believes, but also knows that his faith can grow. How very close this Father is to us. The focus of attention now turns to the crowd who are converging upon him. This makes it necessary for Jesus to act quickly to bring this situation to a speedy conclusion. Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit. There's that word epitimao again. Throughout this gospel, that verb has been used of the demotic. Jesus then addresses the spirit, mute and deaf spirit. I command you, go out from him and no longer enter him. The spirit is to depart and never return. The spirit obeys, but not without one final burst of power, crying out and convulsing, he came out. The exorcism has been accomplished by Jesus. At the end of the ordeal, the young lad, freed from the spirit, falls to the ground looking as if dead. The demon had thrown and convulsed the child. Now, without the demon, he lies still, as if dead. Onlookers are saying that he is dead, but Jesus knows that he's not. He takes the boy's hand, and he raises him, and he gets up. The uses of death and resurrection images here are significant. The verbs raise and get up, used here, are, as we have seen, the two words used for the resurrection. The boy died to his state of being in the power of the evil demon, and now rises to a new life of freedom with his father. The faith of the father has been rewarded. The request that he made of Jesus has been answered. The father has been a man of faith and a man of action. In fact, his faith led him to action. In seemingly impossible situations, we can let ourselves be consumed with pity and despair. There's nothing I can do about it. Or, through faith, we can be people of action, approaching a situation in a spirit of faith. Barclay explains, it is to make it a possibility. Having resolved the father's situation, there is still one thread that needs to be brought to a conclusion: the disciples. So Jesus and the disciples enter the house, as has happened at several junctures in this gospel. Once alone, the disciples inevitably question him privately. Why could we not cast out the demon? They had been given the power to do such in Mark chapter 6, verse 7. Jesus responds that this type of demon is impossible to expel except through prayer. Here lies the second lesson of this text. The one who does God's work must have a relationship with God, which is developed through prayer. We must be people of prayer to keep us alive and vibrant in our lives, and keep us humble, realizing that what we do is not us, but God working through us. Thus, faith nourished by prayer is a key to success in life. The second prediction of the Passion follows. This is the shortest of the three predictions. The text notes that the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying. What else is new? Their vision is still unclear. They're seeing blurredly. They realize this, but are afraid to question Jesus concerning his meaning. Now, leaving the house where the discussion with the disciples took place, Jesus continues to travel through Galilee. But as has been the case previously in the gospel, Jesus wants to travel incognito. This time, a reason is given. He was teaching his disciples and did not want the content of the teaching to be known. As we shall see, it is a reiteration of the prediction of the Passion and the sufferings that was given in chapter 8 last session. The content of this private teaching follows. The Son of Man. Remember, this was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. And so Jesus will be handed over into the hands of men. In the ancient world, to fall into the hands of was to fall under the control of. This refers to the arrest that will take place in the garden, and the actions at the hands of the Sanhedrin and Pilate, into whose control the arrest party will bring Jesus. They will kill him, and having killed him, after 3 days he will rise again. One of the words used to designate the resurrection, anhistemi. The reaction of the disciples to this second statement of Jesus' fate is misunderstanding and fear. Their understanding is blocked by their preconceived notions of Messiah, and they're afraid to ask Jesus about his views on the subject. The misunderstanding is brought to the fore in the discussion of the disciples on the road which follows the second prediction. They're still looking to a political renewal where Jesus and his disciples will be the chief rulers of the land. Thus, their discussion on the road concerned who would be the most important. The journey through Galilee brings them to Capernaum, the base of operations. They enter the house, and Jesus asks the disciples what they were discussing on the road as they were traveling. This reduces the disciples to silence. They did not want to tell him the content of their discussion because they were discussing the pressing question of who of them was the greater. That is, who was the most important? Who would hold the chief position next to Jesus in the renewed Israel? Again, Jesus must correct them. They are still misunderstanding what this journey is all about. Jesus sits down, which is the position of the teacher, and calls the 12 and tells them once again what being first is all about. If someone wishes to be first, he must be last and servant of all. Importance in the kingdom is putting others first and being of service. Importance is not something that comes because one is in a position of authority. Importance, power, and respect comes from how they will acknowledge, respect, and serve others. That's quite out of sync with our societal values. To illustrate this, Jesus takes a little child, stands the child in their midst, he then embraces the child and speaks, "Whoever would receive one of such children in my name receives me." There are two principles at work here. First, in the ancient world, there are several stories of heroes or gods who roam around the earth incognito. They're trying to see how they will be treated and received. Only at the end is the revelation of who they really are. The message is one that has been enshrined in the Benedictine monastery since the time of Benedict. Treat all as though they were Christ. This is the basic principle that also motivated the ministry of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. The second principle is illustrated in the next part of Jesus' statement. Whoever should receive me receives not me, but the one who sent me. The Jewish principles of agency began with the principle that an agent is like to the sender. Thus, the Father sending Jesus implies that Jesus is to be accepted and treated as though he were God the Father. The implication is that Jesus' reception from the authorities has not been very positive and will become even less positive as this gospel moves forward. How then can the disciples possibly think of importance and power? They can expect treatment similar to what Jesus will receive. Now, in our day, the chances of being put to death for our belief in Jesus are somewhat remote, at least in the Midwest of the United States. But the chances of being made fun of, mocked, and treated ill are very great. That's what Jesus says is the cost of following him. Jesus has taken a child to illustrate this point. The child is innocent. The child is helpless. The disciples must take on the characteristics of this child. They must be welcomed as a child, for in that welcome Christ will be present, and through Christ the Father who sent him. It's not honor, it's not glory, it's service. A series of sayings are appended, telling us that it's better to enter the kingdom maimed than have all of one's members and find oneself in Gehenna. The kingdom is such a precious thing that there is nothing that should hinder us from achieving it, whether it be others leading us astray or ourselves giving into temptation to do things that will lead us away from the kingdom. These statements are pretty stark and can lead to some dire circumstances. First, if someone should ensnare a person to cause them to veer from the path of faith, this is the key meaning of the verb scandalizo, which is used here. As we have seen, and it gives us the English scandal or scandalize, but really it refers to ensnarement or entrapment with an intent to trick. Now, if somebody tries that, it would be better for them if a millstone, literally a mule-drawn millstone, were put around their neck and they were cast into the sea. Now, a millstone is used in the process of milling or grinding grain. It's a very large and heavy stone, which is ground against another stone with the grain in between. Humans can turn the stone to grind it, or animals, such as a mule, can do it. This is the picture of a millstone. The top, the smaller part, is fit into the lower, larger part, and the whole is used to grind. Now, either of those tied around one's neck when they're thrown into the sea is not going to be good. The image is here to make a point. I don't think Jesus is saying that those who lead a person of faith astray should be killed on the spot. Rather, the picture of a millstone taking one to the bottom of the sea should be a deterrent to leading another astray. Similarly, the material on chopping off hands, gouging out eyes, etc. These are generally considered to be hyperbole to picture a deterrent from action. So Jesus says, if your hand causes you to stumble, scandalize, cut it off. Now, in Middle Eastern law, in some countries, it does recommend exactly this treatment. What Jesus here is saying is to root out the base causes of temptation. If hanging out with certain people causes you to sin, change the people you hang out with. If reading certain books or magazines cause you to sin, change your reading habits. Then Jesus gives a principle. It's better that you enter life crippled than enter Gehenna with two hands to the unquenchable fire. The valley south of Jerusalem was known as the Valley of Hinnom, or Gehinnom in Hebrew, which can be seen in this picture. It was in the Valley of Hinnom that children were sacrificed to the god Molech by immolation. But there is another derivation of the name Gehenna. It can refer to the area just outside of what is known today as the Dung Gate, as seen in this picture. In Jesus' day, it was the garbage heap for the city of Jerusalem. The garbage was burned, and so at that spot was a constantly burning fire just to the right of the gate. The second derivation would speak graphically to one of Jesus' listeners. The text continues with a similar fate for the eye or the foot that causes one to sin. A series of appended sayings on salt are added, ending with the admonishment, "Be at peace with one another." This will ensure that no one will try to lead another astray. As Jesus enters the region of Judea, he's met by a contingent of Pharisees who pose a problem for him. The problem is what to do about divorce. This was a question which was hotly debated among various teachers of the day. The intent of the Pharisees questioning Jesus was to see where he stood in the debate. There is a change of locale as we move into the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel. The area is Judea across the Jordan. This map shows the area of Jesus' later ministry. To the far right and bottom is the Salt Sea, also known as the Dead Sea. Just above it is the Jordan River, which flows into the Dead Sea. To the west of the Jordan is an area of Judea. It is here that these units take place. Once Jesus arrived at his destination, crowds gathered and he began to teach them. The added phrase, "as was his custom," coupled with the use of the imperfect tense, lets us know that this was a normal occurrence in the ministry of Jesus. It's not an isolated incident. This is further affirmed by the double use of "again." This sets the scene for the protagonist to enter. The Pharisees approach with a question. Now, this was not anything unusual from what we've seen in the gospel thus far. This time, their question concerns divorce. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, this question was a politically hot topic. There were many rabbinic debates over it, as we shall see below. Mark tells us that their intent was to test him. Jesus has an immediate answer for them. In typical rabbinic style, he answers a question with another question. What did Moses command you? They answer citing the text of Moses found at Deuteronomy 24:1-3, specifying when divorce was permitted. Jesus explains that Moses was being lenient because of their hardness of heart. Divorce is permitted because of human weakness. The law was there to keep divorce in check, not encourage it. The text of Deuteronomy 24:1 states that if a man takes a wife and marries her, and if she then finds no favor in his eyes because he found some indecency in her, he writes a bill of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. And she thus departs from his house. Now, the question that arose among the rabbis over this text was precisely concerning the meaning of eriwath davar, indecency. The rabbis debated vehemently concerning what this constituted. In Jesus' day, there were two schools of rabbinic thought on the meaning of eriwath davar, or indecency. The first was the school of Shammai, which was somewhat conservative. Shammai took a rather strict view, allowing divorce only in the case of known unchastity. The other prominent school was that of Hillel, who permitted divorce for almost any reason. The Mishnah says that a man may divorce his wife even if she has merely ruined his dinner. Both Shammai and Hillel are attempting to define indecency as it appears in Deuteronomy. Now, a third opinion comes from another rather famous rabbi of the day, Akiba. The Mishnah tells us that he, a husband, may divorce his wife if he finds another woman more beautiful than she is, as it says, if she finds no favor in his eyes. So you can see then the opinions are quite divergent. The Pharisees' question is an attempt to see where Jesus stands in this whole question. Jesus then gives his understanding. He moves beyond Moses in Deuteronomy to the very beginning in Genesis, citing Genesis 1:27 and 2:24. Introducing Jesus' answer, Mark uses the adversative particle de. Really, it means here, now I'll tell you how I see the situation. In the beginning, God created them. Male and female, he created them. It's a citation of Genesis 1:27. And for that reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a citation of Deuteronomy 2:24. The verb joined, proskolethesetai, literally means being glued to or will be glued to. The implication is that the bond of man and woman in marriage is a permanent one. Jesus then reiterates the teaching of Genesis for the current time. They are no longer two, but one flesh. This has a sense of a permanency also with regards to the bond. As a result, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. The position of Jesus is more conservative, if you will, than even Shammai. The bond of marriage is seen as a permanent bond, and hence, as it was in the beginning, divorce is not possible. Thus, today, in the context of the marriage ritual, after the couple has pronounced their vows, joining themselves to each other, the priest or deacon who is witnessing their marriage announces that principle of Jesus. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Again, there is private instruction to the disciples on this question. In the house, the disciples further question Jesus on divorce. In his instruction, Jesus explains his understanding of marriage and divorce in plain terms. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. This reflects the Jewish custom. The husband could file the bill of divorce. The wife couldn't. But then continues with the corollary. If she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. This is reflective of the custom among the Gentiles. Either the husband or the wife could initiate the divorce procedure among Gentiles. Now, there are some objections to this based on the infamous case of Herodias, who left her husband Philip to marry Herod Antipas. There are also other document cases where the woman has initiated a divorce procedure in Judaism. Thus, some feel that this corollary is a comment in the case of Herodias, which eventually led to the death of John the Baptist, and not a distinction between Jewish and Gentile customs. The journey will continue as Jesus moves from Galilee to Jerusalem in the next unit. We shall see the encounter with the rich young man, the third and longest prediction of the Passion, and Jesus' definitive teaching on discipleship in answer to the request of James and John. This will be followed by the second blind man cure, the cure of Bartimaeus in the town of Jericho.